Hello and welcome to another Decode video lesson. Last time we talked about how we can sort of save snippets of instructions and wait for certain things to happen before those are executed, events. So for example, when you click on a button inside a program, you can then do something with that button. There are other things that are really important to creating applications and programming. And one of these things is this concept of remembering things. Why is it important for a computer to be able to remember information? Well, it's the same reason it's important for us to remember information. It's to help us perform tasks for ourselves or for other people. For example, you could be driving along in your car and you want to be going to a destination and you want to know whether when you arrive at a certain turn, whether you need to turn down that street or keep going or turn left or right at an intersection. And you would have looked up the directions beforehand. And so at some stage you would have known where to turn and where not to turn. So you need to remember that or keep that information in some way. And you need to know whether to turn down the street or not and memorize and remember the name of that. Or, and as well as that, you could be delivering some information. You'd be going from one building to another building and there's some sort of important piece of information. For example, one building is a fruit store and another building is your house, and you've been asked by a family member how many fruit are available at the fruit store. So you've got to remember that number on your way back, as well as remembering the directions from point A to point B. And that's just one of the variety of things that you'll need to remember along the way. And there are all different kinds of things that you need to remember, taking different forms in your mind. And there are lots of other ways to store information. You could try and remember it and recite it when you need to, or you could, for example, write it down on a piece of paper, or you could give it to somebody else to remember and ask them to tell you later. And the same deal goes for computers. It's just as important for a computer or an application to be able to remember these things, and there are also lots of different ways for them to remember certain pieces of information. And one of those big pieces of ways of remembering that are really important to computers is this idea of these things called variables. Now, variables, as the name suggests, are things that vary. So they're little pieces of information that we can store inside our program and then come back to them and then change them later and then just constantly refer to them to help us basically remember things. And variables come in a bunch of different types. So there could, for example, we could create a number variable and set it to 4. So what we've done here is we've used this var statement, which is JavaScript's way of creating a variable, this programming language, and then we've given it a name. So we've called it number variable. And then we've come up with this equal sign and set it to 4. So you have a right-hand side of this and a left-hand side. The left-hand side, you decide what the name is, and on the right-hand side, you give it its value. And you only need to say this var statement once. So if you want to redefine this, give it a different value, we don't have to type var again. We can just go ahead now and give it a different value. And it's as easy as that. So you only need to use that. You don't need to define it once. And different programming languages have different types for variables. So this, for example, is a number one, and there are a whole bunch of different things that we could go over. But let's keep it simple. So numbers can be all sorts of numbers. So we can, for example, make it 3.4321, and that's as easy as that. And there are other kinds of variables. For example, we can make a string variable, which is a way of storing text inside a little snippet of information. And we can use these double quotes to create a string variable, or we can use these single quotes to create a string variable. What's important though is that all the stuff that we're trying to remember, all the text, is inside those two quotes. By the way, what I'm doing with these double slashes here is I'm creating a comment, which is a way of writing code that is not important to the computer, but important to us. It helps us read and identify what things are doing. So this means nothing to the computer. It only means stuff to us when we're reading it. So it really helps us to sort of outline what's going on. Another kind of variable is something called a Boolean variable, which can be true or false. And that means either yes or no. And we'll go over what this means later on, but it's important to know sort of what they are because they're really important, as you'll find later on. We have some sort of more special kinds of things that we can store in memory. For example, we have a function variable, which we sort of went over last time what a function is. It lets us store a snippet of code, so useful for storing a snippet of code. And it lets us reuse that code again and again and again. And then there's something called an array, which again, we can go over later. But this lets us store lots of variables in one, or lots of information. So this isn't just one variable, it'll be many when we get around to using them. And the last one is this kind of object variable, which is special. And it lets us do a lot of different things. Let me explain what this object variable is, because we've actually been using it a lot already. This var statement I've been using in every single one of these lessons so far. So let's create some variables that we actually want to use in our program. So I'm going to type this var statement and I'm going to put button and equals new rect. And I'm going to put a button in the middle of the stage. And here we got it, but we've made a variable and we've assigned this rectangle to it, and we haven't come up with a rectangle variable. Well, actually what we're doing with this new rect is we're creating a new rectangle object. New rectangle object. And we're storing it in a variable. So this object variable encompasses a whole bunch of different things, and rectangle is one of them. And now that we've stored it in an object, we can make references to it. So I can say button dot fill, which we've been doing all this time, and then pass a string to it with a color name, and then we can fill it with red. And then finally, we can then refer to it again and then add to the stage. And the stage is another variable that already exists inside this program. We already know about it. So what this dot does is it lets us sort of access variables inside the object. So think of an object as a container for a variety of different variables, and that we can then refer to later and then do lots of interesting things with it. So let's see what we can do with these variables. So let's make some text. Let's make some text to display the variables that we made. So let's make a variable called clicks, which can be a number, and then a variable called string, which can be just some text that we want to refer to later. And then let's make a text object, two text objects. So go var clicks text equals new text, and we'll pass clicks to that. And var string text equals new text string. So we're actually passing a variable that we've already made into this text. And then you'll find when we add these, when we add those things to the stage. So I'll just separate the stage into a different comment, to a different section, so we can sort of see what's going on. We can go string text dot add to stage, and then clicks text dot add to stage. And you see while I was doing that, these text boxes got added here. As you can see, they're overlapping each other because they're actually in the same place. What I need to do is then say make clicks text a bit lower, so we can set its Y to 30. And now you can see we've got high up there and then 1 over there. And they're a bit small, so what we can also do is then say make them bigger. So clicks text dot font size, again, setting variables just as we were before, equals 30. And makes it a bit bigger, and then we can go string text dot font size equals 30. And hey, we've got that there. So now what we want to do is go back to our event-based programming and add some events to the button. So when you click on the button, we want to pass a function to it and then use this reusable snippet of code to do a whole bunch of things. What we can do is we can use maths. So we can say clicks equals clicks plus 1, and then clicks text dot text. We're going to reassign that number and then pass it back to the text variable inside clicks text. And now when I click on this number goes up, and we're keeping track of that. I can click on that for as long as I want. And we can also use other kinds of maths. So I can do ×2 as opposed to +1. And you'll see that every time I click on it, it goes up, it gets multiplied by 2. Or I can divide by 2. And then it gets smaller. Or I can subtract 1, wrap it in brackets, then multiply it by 2.5, and then add 7, and then wrap that in brackets, and then divide it by 1.1. And then you get really weird numbers like that. But you can do anything you want as far as these four mathematical symbols go. You can subtract, you can multiply, you can add, and you can divide in any order you want. What happens when you try and add something to a string? Because it's not a number. So you couldn't really do anything with it. Well, let's see what happens. String equals string plus, let's add another high. And let's see what happens. String text equals string. Now when I click on this, another high appears, and then another high appears, another high appears. What we're doing is we're actually doing this thing called concatenation, where you combine two strings together. So that's what the plus and the concept of a string means. And it doesn't really have a concept of multiplication or division or subtraction, but it does have this concept of plus. So when you add a string to another string, you combine them. So we can put a space in, and then we can sort of add an exclamation mark, and then we can sort of make them separate words. So hi, 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 and it goes on forever. We can't see it continuing to add, but it's going off past the screen where we can't see it. And that's really the basics of variables. You can store them, you can refer back to things, which really empowers you to do all sorts of things that weren't possible before. In fact, the things that we were trying to do before weren't possible because we're using variables the whole time with this var button equals nonsense. Without that, we couldn't really have gone anywhere. And we were using this E before, which stored the coordinates of our clicks in the last lesson. We actually wrote event. And that was a variable that let us access information. So really, you can't do anything without these variables, not sensibly, not create interesting interactive software. So that's why this is really important. And we're going to go over what all these different kinds of variables mean and why they're useful and how we can access them, because they're really powerful. And we've only just scratched the surface. And really, I encourage you to stay tuned for the next one. Fiddle around with this code on the Decode website and see what you can come up with. But until then, well, I'll see you next time. See ya.